Lady Clara Bennet adjusted the ribbon, holding her brown hair, as she realized her life was about to change. Crossing the village library, seeking a moment of peace amidst the chaos of her routine as a teacher, she came face to face with the most imposing man she had ever encountered. Edward Langston, the Duke of Langston, stood near a shelf, his austere expression intimidating even the books. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice as firm as his gaze. "And why would a duke need me?" Clara replied, trying to mask her nervousness. She wasn't used to dealing with people like him. Nobles typically ignored her, and she had always found that comfortable. Edward Langston was everything Clara disliked, distant, severe, and impenetrable. Yet at the same time, there was something intriguing about him. Like an abandoned castle, he seemed to harbor secrets no one dared to explore. And now, here he was, asking for something that sounded impossible. "I need a wife," he said. Plain and simple. No embellishments, no explanations. Clara blinked, thinking she had misheard. "Excuse me, what did you say?" Edward sighed, as if he had anticipated her reaction. "My position requires that I marry. I need to impress certain business associates. But I trust few people. You, Lady Clara, seem like a suitable candidate. Intelligent, practical, discreet. Accept, and I will fund your school for children." Clara froze. He knew that she struggled every day to keep the village's small school running, that she constantly worried about the bills and the future of the children who depended on her. "And if I refuse?" she asked, crossing her arms, trying to ignore the spark of hope growing in her chest. "I'd have to find someone else," Edward replied, though his eyes said otherwise. He didn't have a plan B. Clara was his only option, and that gave her an unexpected advantage. "But you won't refuse. It's not in your nature to abandon those who need you." And he was right. The idea of marrying a duke was absurd, but Clara couldn't ignore the possibility of saving her school. The offer was clear, and she knew the answer was inevitable. Taking a deep breath, she responded, "Very well. But know this, I will not be an easy bride to deal with." "I hope you won't be," Edward said, and a faint hint of a smile played on his lips. Clara Bennet could hardly believe her eyes as she approached Langston Hall for the first time. The carriage rolled down a long driveway lined with sturdy oaks, and ahead loomed the Duke's imposing mansion. It was more than she had imagined: towering spires, perfectly manicured gardens, and an opulence that made her heart race. The setting was breathtaking but overwhelming. "Did I really agree to this?" she whispered to herself. Edward Langston, seated beside her, raised an eyebrow. "You seem troubled, Lady Clara. Change can be uncomfortable, but don't worry. Langston Hall is very efficient at swallowing its inhabitants whole." His tone was dry, but Clara detected a hint of irony that made her smile, despite herself. As they arrived at the entrance, Clara was greeted by Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, a tall, thin woman who seemed to carry the weight of Langston Hall on her shoulders. "Welcome, Lady Clara," she said with a slight nod. Clara didn't miss the brief glance Mrs. Harrow shot at Edward, as if to silently ask, "Is this serious?" Inside the mansion, Clara barely had a moment to breathe before being swept into a whirlwind of preparations. Her promotion from teacher to future duchess demanded endless hours of etiquette lessons, dress fittings, and memorizing the extensive genealogies of aristocratic families. It all felt like a performance, as though she were merely an object to be shaped for the sole purpose of impressing others. One morning, while Clara attempted to balance a teacup with the grace Mrs. Harrow demanded, Edward entered the drawing room, watching the scene with a restrained smile. "It's fascinating to see you struggle with something as simple as tea," he remarked, teasing. "It seems teaching children is easier than becoming a duchess." Clara looked up at him, exasperated. "Well, at least children don't expect me to memorize the names of 50 distant relatives I'll never meet." Edward chuckled, a low, unexpected sound that made Clara falter for a moment. "Fair point, Lady Clara, but trust me, knowing those names will come in handy. They enjoy testing anyone who enters their circle." As the days passed, Clara began to notice something peculiar about Edward. Despite his rigid exterior and formal demeanor, he was meticulous about ensuring her comfort, even if it meant arguing with Mrs. Harrow over her excessively demanding schedule. He seemed considerate, though he would never admit it. Langston Hall came with its own set of challenges. During an informal dinner with some of Edward's relatives, Clara became the target of sharp questions from Lady Victoria, a distant cousin with a smile as cutting as her words. "So, Lady Clara," Victoria began, toying with her wine glass, "where exactly do you come from? I'm sure your pedigree is interesting." Clara took a deep breath, resisting the urge to pour her soup over the woman's head. "I grew up in a small village, teaching children and living a simple life," she replied calmly. "It's surprising how much simplicity can teach us about character, isn't it?" Edward watched the exchange silently, but Clara caught the glimmer of approval in his eyes. After dinner, he found her in the gardens where she had gone to cool her temper. "You were brilliant," he said, his tone warmer than she had expected. "Brilliant would have been avoiding the dinner altogether," Clara retorted, still fuming. "Your cousin has the tact of a bull in a china shop." Edward smiled, and for a moment, he seemed like a different man, more human. "They will test you, Clara, always, but you're doing better than I expected." Despite the challenges, Clara began to see Langston Hall differently. The village children were often invited to small garden parties, their laughter filling the mansion in a way that Persian rugs and crystal chandeliers never could. Edward reluctantly attended these gatherings, watching from a distance as Clara laughed with the children. One afternoon, while Clara was reading to a group of youngsters in the music room, Edward approached quietly. "You truly transform this place," he said almost to himself. Clara felt the warmth in his words but pretended not to notice. Even so, she couldn't ignore the fact that this was all an arrangement, a facade to impress investors. Edward Langston was considerate, but was he capable of something more? As she stood on the veranda, gazing at the horizon, a question began to weigh on her heart. Am I falling for the man behind the title? The atmosphere at Langston Hall felt different that morning. Clara could sense the tension lingering in the air as she strolled through the gardens. Edward was more reserved than usual, his gaze distant as he pored over documents in the music room. Something was wrong, but Clara knew the Duke wasn't one to easily share his troubles. That afternoon, she decided to take a chance. Entering the music room, she found Edward at the piano, playing melancholy notes that echoed through the space. She had never heard him play before, and the depth of the melody took her by surprise. Approaching cautiously, she spoke. "That piece. It feels as full of pain as it does beauty." Edward paused but didn't turn immediately. "It's one of my mother's compositions," he said quietly. "She used to play it to teach me that even in pain, there is something to be learned." Clara hesitated, then sat beside him. "Do you miss her?" He finally looked at her, his brown eyes revealing something she had never seen before, a mix of vulnerability and exhaustion. "I miss what she represented. After she died, everything changed." Those words opened a door Clara hadn't expected. Edward began to speak about his past with an honesty that surprised them both. He told her about the scandal that had nearly ruined his reputation. Years ago, he had been engaged to Lady Margaret, a young woman from an influential family. But on the day of their wedding, Margaret had run off with an army officer, leaving Edward to face society's cruel judgment alone. "After that, I learned not to trust so easily," he admitted, his voice tinged with bitterness. "The title of Duke is both a shield and a cage. People only see what they want to see." Clara felt a pang in her heart. She knew what it was like to be judged, though in a different way. Her life as a teacher had always been dismissed by the aristocracy, but hearing Edward's story made her understand the burden he carried. "Not everyone sees just the title," she said gently. "Some see the man." Edward studied her for a moment, as if searching for something in her eyes. But before he could respond, the door to the music room swung open, and Lady Victoria entered, her presence like thunder on a serene day. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her irritation evident as she took in the sight of Clara and Edward together. Clara stood quickly, feeling the air grow heavy once again. Edward, however, remained calm. "Victoria, if you're here to complain about something, save it for later," he said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Victoria shot Clara a frosty glare before leaving, but the damage was done. The brief intimacy between Clara and Edward had dissipated. Later, Clara encountered Mrs. Harrow in the corridor. Curiously, the housekeeper seemed inclined to speak. "Lady Clara," she began cautiously, "Langston Hall is a place of secrets. Not everything is as it seems." Intrigued, Clara tried to press for more, but Mrs. Harrow quickly returned to her duties. The mention of secrets unsettled her. What else was Edward hiding? And why did it feel as though there was so much resistance to her presence in the household? That night, as Clara sought solace in her quarters, a knock at her door startled her. Edward stood there, his voice low and almost hesitant. "May I come in?" Clara nodded, surprised. He seemed different, less rigid, more human. "I want to apologize," he began, stepping inside slowly, "for everything you've had to endure here. I didn't expect you to be so brave." "Brave? Me?" Clara laughed softly. "I can barely walk gracefully without tripping over my own dress." Edward smiled at her quip, but quickly turned serious. "You've brought something to Langston Hall that I thought was lost. Something my mother had. A way of seeing hope where others see only problems." Clara felt her cheeks warm, but before she could respond, Edward continued. "I want you to know that, regardless of what others think, you belong here. More than many who were born into this world." His words stayed with Clara through the night. Was it possible that, beneath all the pretense of their arrangement and his guarded exterior, Edward was truly opening up to her? Or was it just another layer of the enigma that was the Duke of Langston? The tension in the air was palpable as Langston Hall prepared to host a grand ball organized by Edward. It was the first time Clara would be officially introduced as the Duke's fiancée. Though she had spent weeks adjusting to the demands of aristocratic life, tonight felt like the ultimate test. "They won't accept a commoner like me," Clara confided to Mrs. Harrow while adjusting the ribbon on her sky blue gown. "They will," the housekeeper replied firmly, her gaze steady. "Because you have something many of them lack, courage and purpose." The main hall was dazzling that evening, illuminated by hundreds of candles casting a golden glow over the impeccably dressed nobility. Clara descended the grand staircase with measured steps, each movement rehearsed in her mind. At the bottom, she found Edward, immaculate in his black coat, his usual intense gaze fixed on her. "You look magnificent," he said. Though his words were formal, something in his tone made her cheeks flush. "I hope it's enough," Clara replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "It's enough," Edward assured her, offering his arm. "And if it isn't, we'll make it enough." Clara stayed close to Edward as they were introduced to the guests, many of whom cast critical glances and whispered among themselves. Lady Victoria, with her characteristic arrogance, was the first to approach. "Oh, Lady Clara, how fortunate you are to win the heart of a duke, or at least his attention." Clara met her with a tight smile. "Some of us achieve what others only dream of." Before the conversation could deepen, the air in the room seemed to chill as an unexpected figure entered. Lady Margaret. Clara instantly knew who she was. The murmurs around the room confirmed it. Edward's former fiancée, the woman who had abandoned him, was back, wearing a vibrant red dress and exuding confidence with a smile that seemed almost predatory. Edward stiffened visibly at the sight of her. Clara felt his arm tense under her hand. Margaret walked directly toward them, disregarding the unspoken rules of decorum. "Edward," she said, her tone dripping with familiarity, "it seems you've found yourself a new distraction." Clara knew she should step back, but something inside her refused to be intimidated. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Lady Margaret," she said, her voice composed. "I've heard so many stories about you." Margaret arched an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Clara's boldness. "Oh, I'm sure they were fascinating stories," she replied, her eyes gleaming with malice. Edward, finally regaining his composure, intervened. "Margaret, I wasn't expecting to see you here. If you'd like to talk, we can do so later." "Talk?" Margaret laughed, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "After all these years, do you think I have anything to say? I only came to wish your new fiancée good luck. She'll need it." Clara felt the weight of every gaze on her. Public humiliation loomed like a predator in the room. But instead of retreating, she stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "Luck, Lady Margaret, is something people like me earn," she said. "And if you'll excuse us, there are other guests who require our attention." With that, Clara linked her arm with Edward's and guided him away, her hand trembling slightly on his arm. Later, on the terrace, Clara turned to Edward, her face flushed with frustration. "Why is she here? Why didn't you tell me she might show up?" Edward sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I didn't know. Margaret has always been unpredictable, but you handled her better than I ever could." "I don't want to handle this," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. "I knew this would be difficult, but you need to be honest with me, Edward. If we're going to pretend to be a couple, I can't be blindsided like this." He stepped closer, the intensity in his gaze sharper than ever. "Clara, this isn't pretend for me anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Clara stared at him, the weight of his confession pressing against her chest. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hall interrupted them. Lady Victoria appeared, looking more satisfied than usual. "I hate to intrude, but it seems Margaret has found something interesting in the offices of Langston Hall. You might want to check on it, Edward." Edward's expression darkened as he frowned, immediately leaving Clara and heading toward the hall. Clara followed, a growing sense of dread tightening in her chest. What more could this past possibly bring to light? Edward's footsteps echoed through the corridors as he strode toward the offices of Langston Hall. Clara followed close behind, her heart racing. She knew Margaret was dangerous, but what could she have possibly uncovered? And why did Lady Victoria seem so pleased about the chaos that was about to unfold? When they reached the library adjacent to the offices, Margaret was standing there, rifling through a thick stack of papers. She looked up with a triumphant smile as they entered. "Ah, Edward, I didn't know you still kept such sentimental records." "What are you doing here, Margaret?" Edward demanded, his voice firm. Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. Margaret held up one of the papers, waving it slightly. "Mementos of the past. Contracts, letters, promissory notes. It seems you've been doing much more than managing estates, haven't you? These documents reveal quite a significant debt." Clara's eyes widened as she turned to Edward. He kept his gaze locked on Margaret but didn't deny her claim. "This is none of your concern," he replied coldly. "Oh, but it's so fascinating," Margaret continued, now directing her attention to Clara. "Did you know that the great Duke of Langston has mortgaged parts of his lands to maintain this grand facade? That he's at the mercy of investors like those you so bravely confronted tonight?" Clara froze. She knew Edward carried financial responsibilities like any aristocrat, but she hadn't imagined his situation was this precarious. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward finally turned to her, his expression softening. "Yes, it's true. Langston Hall has debts I've been working to repay for years. Part of the reason for this marriage was to secure the investors' trust." "And the other part?" Clara pressed, refusing to look away. "I thought you'd understand," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Margaret, clearly delighted by their discomfort, placed the papers back on the desk. "Well, I won't intrude any further. but I suggest you both consider how this might play out when the investors find out." With a venomous smile, she swept out of the room, leaving them alone. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara's thoughts raced as she looked at Edward, who now appeared more vulnerable than ever. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. "I didn't think it mattered," he replied. "I've spent years trying to shield this place, these people, from the weight of my mistakes. Bringing you into it wasn't part of the plan." "But I am part of it now," Clara said firmly, stepping closer. "And if you expect me to stand by you, I need the truth. No more surprises, Edward." He nodded, his usual stoicism cracking just slightly. "You deserve the truth, about everything." But before he could say more, the distant hum of voices from the ballroom reminded them of the waiting guests. For now, the conversation would have to wait. "You should have told me," Clara said after a long silence. "I came here thinking I was helping you, but it feels like I've barely scratched the surface." "I didn't want to burden you," Edward replied, his tone almost defensive. "It's already difficult enough for you to face society. I thought I could at least spare you from this." "Edward, I can handle the truth," she retorted, her voice gaining strength. "What I can't handle are secrets." He nodded, finally yielding. "You're right, and I promise that from now on, nothing will be hidden from you." The two spent the rest of the night going over the papers together. Clara saw the full extent of the debts and began to understand the immense pressure Edward was under. Langston Hall wasn't just a grand mansion, it was a symbol of generations of responsibility, tradition, and now, financial strain. By morning, the rumors had already begun to spread. As expected, Lady Victoria wasted no time in fueling the gossip. When Clara ventured into the village for a walk, she was met with whispers and curious glances. Upon returning, she found Edward in the garden, lost in thought. He looked up as she approached. "If you want to walk away, I won't blame you," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. Clara was taken aback by his words. She stepped closer, stopping directly in front of him. "Do you really think I'm the type to run?" Edward sighed, but a faint smile appeared on his lips. "I think you're the type to face things head-on, even when you shouldn't." "Then you know me well," Clara replied with a hint of humor before softening her tone. "I'm not going anywhere, Edward. Langston Hall isn't just your responsibility now. We're in this together." Their moment was interrupted by Mrs. Harrow, who appeared with a grave expression. "Your Grace, Lady Clara, the investors have arrived earlier than expected. They're waiting in the main hall." Clara's heart began to race again. She knew this meeting would be pivotal, not just for Edward, but for the future of everything they were trying to build together. "Then let's face them," Clara said, extending her hand to Edward. He took it, a spark of determination in his eyes. And together they walked to the hall, ready to fight for Langston Hall, and for themselves. The main hall of Langston Hall felt more imposing than ever. Clara entered arm in arm with Edward, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. The investors were gathered in a semicircle near the grand fireplace, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Eduardo Mendoza, the most influential among them, was the first to rise. "Duke Langston, it seems we were summoned here with some urgency," he said, his voice carrying a faint Spanish accent. His sharp eyes flicked between Edward and Clara, shining with inquisitiveness. "I presume you have something important to tell us." Edward stepped forward, maintaining his composure. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your attendance. I am aware that rumors have been circulating about Langston Hall's finances. Allow me to set the record straight." As Edward spoke, Clara observed the faces around the room. Some seemed genuinely interested, while others clearly remained unconvinced. Eduardo Mendoza, however, listened intently, his gaze shifting between Edward and Clara with subtle curiosity. When Edward finished, Eduardo raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the group. That explains your current situation, Duke, but why should we believe that you can offer financial security in the future? Before Edward could respond, Clara stepped forward, startling everyone, including Edward. Because he isn't alone, she said firmly, her voice steady. Langston Hall isn't just a property. It's a community. I've seen firsthand the impact this land has on the people who live and work here. Together we can revitalize it. The investors exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her intervention. Clara pressed on, addressing Eduardo directly. If your concern is the future, consider this. Langston Hall isn't merely relying on tradition, it's evolving. We are implementing new initiatives to modernize agricultural operations and increase profitability. This isn't just a plan, it's a promise. Eduardo raised an eyebrow, his intrigue evident. And you truly believe, Lady Clara, that you can help the Duke achieve this? I do, Clara replied without hesitation. And I'm willing to stake everything on it. For a moment, silence filled the room before Eduardo began to clap, slow and deliberate. Well said, Lady Clara, your passion is remarkable. I will give my decision careful consideration. The air felt lighter, a collective sense of relief rippling through the room. But the moment was abruptly shattered by the dramatic entrance of Margaret. Oh, what a stirring performance, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But unfortunately, passion doesn't pay debts. The investors shifted uncomfortably as Margaret strode to the center of the hall, an envelope clutched in her hand. With theatrical flair, she opened it, pulling out a sheet of paper. And here, she announced, her voice rising for effect, we have clear evidence that the Duke of Langston is teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Edward stepped forward, but Clara was quicker. This has already been addressed, she said, confronting Margaret with a defiant stance. Do you really think you can come here, stir up trouble, and not be exposed? Margaret laughed, but her confidence wavered as Clara took another step closer. You didn't come here for the good of Langston Hall, Clara continued, her voice steady and resolute. You came because you can't stand to see Edward moving on. The murmurs among the investors grew louder. Eduardo Mendoza rose again, his brow furrowed as he turned to Margaret. Is this true, Lady Margaret? Are you here simply to sabotage the Duke? Margaret tried to deny it, but her expression betrayed her true motives. Edward finally spoke, his tone sharp and commanding. That's enough, Margaret. You have no place here. Margaret left the hall in a fury, but not before casting a final venomous look at Clara, a silent promise of revenge. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, Eduardo Mendoza approached Edward and Clara. Duke, Lady Clara, today you've shown us more than just words. You've shown courage and determination, and that is something I can support. As the investors began to disperse, Clara felt an enormous weight lift from her shoulders. But before she could fully relax, Edward pulled her aside to a quieter corner of the hall. Why did you do that? He asked, his voice low but filled with emotion. Because I believe in you, Clara replied without hesitation. And because Langston Hall is no longer just your responsibility. It's mine too. Edward looked at her for a long moment before finally speaking. Clara, this began as an agreement, but for me it stopped being one a long time ago. He paused, struggling to find the words. I don't just want you to be here. I want you to be with me. His words hit Clara like a storm. She had known she felt something for Edward, but the depth of her own feelings frightened her. Edward, this is a lot to process, she said softly. I know, he replied, his voice gentle. But I needed you to hear it. Whatever you choose, I want you to know that this, us, is real for me. Clara felt her eyes welling up, but before she could respond, Mrs. Harrow entered the hall, her expression urgent. Your Grace, Lady Clara, we have unexpected visitors at the gate. You should come. Clara and Edward exchanged a glance, both knowing there were still battles ahead. But this time, they would face them together. The night was cold and silent as Clara and Edward reached the main gate of Langston Hall. The flickering torchlight illuminated the figure of a well-dressed man whose very posture radiated arrogance. Beside him stood Margaret, her face adorned with a triumphant smile. "What is the meaning of this?" Edward demanded, his voice laced with authority. The man stepped forward, pulling a letter from his coat pocket. "Duke Langston, I am Lord Radcliffe. I'm here on behalf of my family to discuss a broken contract, a marriage contract to be precise." Clara felt her chest tighten. Edward stepped closer, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "That contract was voided when Margaret abandoned the arrangement," he stated firmly. Radcliffe chuckled, the sound more a threat than amusement. "And yet, my family's reputation was tarnished by your refusal to finalize the agreement. We're here to demand financial reparations, or we'll see to it that your new fiancé bears the consequences." Margaret stepped forward, her tone syrupy but laced with venom. "Oh, Edward, did you really think you could escape so easily? Poor Lady Clara has no idea how cruel this world can be, does she?" Clara, though confused, refused to back down. "If you think you can intimidate me, Margaret, I suggest you find someone else for your games." She turned to Edward, who looked ready to explode, and placed a calming hand on his arm. "This has to stop. We need to settle this once and for all." Edward glanced at her, surprised by her composure. "Clara, they're bluffing. They have no power over us." Radcliffe shrugged, tossing the letter toward Edward. "That depends on how you interpret the words, Langston. I'm certain your investors won't appreciate hearing about this." Edward caught the letter, scanned it quickly, and crumpled it in anger. "This is outright blackmail." "Call it what you like," Radcliffe replied coolly. "I want my reparations, or I'll ruin your reputation, and hers." Clara, taking a deep breath, stepped forward, positioning herself between Edward and Radcliffe. "If you want to destroy me or him, go ahead," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "But know this, Langston Hall will not bow to your threats. I may not be a duchess yet, but I have something you clearly lack: integrity." Margaret's expression twisted in frustration, but Radcliffe hesitated. Clara caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes and pressed on. "Perhaps you should consider what you stand to gain by stepping back now. A partnership with Langston Hall is worth far more than the ruin of your reputation." Edward stepped in, his voice cold as steel. "Radcliffe, you heard Lady Clara? If you choose blackmail, I guarantee you'll never find allies among the nobility again. Langston Hall remains a force, and I will ensure your downfall with every ounce of power I have." The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, Radcliffe stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Very well, Langston. It seems this battle is not mine to win." He turned to Margaret, who looked ready to protest, and muttered something before pulling her away. The pair disappeared into the night, leaving Clara standing firm. As soon as they were gone, her knees weakened. Edward caught her before she could fall. "You were incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anyone face them like that." Clara looked up at him, her heart pounding wildly. "I did what needed to be done. Langston Hall is my home now, and so are you." The words escaped her lips before she could think. Edward stared at her, surprised, and then a gentle smile spread across his face. "Clara." He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes locking with hers. "I love you, not as part of an arrangement, but as the most extraordinary woman I've ever known." Tears slid down Clara's cheeks as she whispered, "I love you too." Edward kissed her, sealing not only their words, but everything they had endured together. The night around them seemed calmer, as though the universe itself had given them its blessing. The next day, the investors were informed of the confrontation's outcome. Eduardo Mendoza, deeply impressed by both Edward and Clara's resolve, declared his full support for the future of Langston Hall. With their allies secured, Edward and Clara began the process of rebuilding everything, stronger and more united than ever. Epilogue. A new era at Langston Hall. The wedding of Edward and Clara was a simple yet unforgettable event, held in the gardens of Langston Hall. Guests from across the region gathered to witness the union of the Duke and the woman who had captured not only his heart, but also the respect of everyone around her. Clara wore a modest white lace gown, her brown hair elegantly pinned back. Edward couldn't take his eyes off her, as if the entire world had vanished, leaving only the two of them. Over the years, Langston Hall flourished. The estates were revitalized, the debts paid off, and Clara's school became a model for other villages, inspiring communities to value education and opportunity. On the veranda of Langston Hall, Edward held Clara's hand as they watched their children playing in the gardens below. "You've transformed this place," he said, his voice filled with affection. Clara smiled, leaning into him. "We've transformed it, together. And together, they would face whatever the future held, knowing that true love was the greatest strength of all." If you were intrigued by the story of a powerful duke chose a common woman to be his bride, but when she faced the aristocracy at dinner, you can't miss the next chapter of this thrilling journey through the aristocracy and its secrets. Find out what happens in The Duke Spurned the Curious Young Woman, but She Uncovered His Greatest Secret. Will Clara be able to face not only the challenges of her new position, but also the darkest secrets surrounding Langston Hall? In this video, we saw how Clara's courage and determination proved that strength of character can overcome any obstacle, even the judgments of high society. A true lesson in how trust and unity can transform lives. If you enjoy lighthearted and fun love stories, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more captivating romances full of surprises. Comment the phrase, "Courage transforms even the greatest challenges," so I'll know you watched until the end. Oh, and in the first pinned comment, I've left links to some amazing books set in the Regency era that I've read and highly recommend. See you in the next video, and remember, love always finds a way.